Welcome back, everyone. And I guess this video is critically important because we're going to talk about a topic and a subject that tends to be one of the critical big four subjects: management, accounting, and finance. Or in some universities, they'll refer to financial management. What is the difference, if any, between these two subjects? And how can you actually excel in them? So we'll be uncovering firstly the similarities and secondly noting the differences, if any. Then we'll talk to what are the common themes that one should look at when they're studying for a subject like management, accounting, and finance. Then thirdly, we'll look at specific subject advice for management accounting. Fourthly, we'll then look at specific subject advice for financial management or finance. And then lastly, we'll then summarize everything. Make sure you watch till the end so that you can get the full benefit of this video. Without wasting more time, let's go straight into it. Now, the first thing that we need to understand is what are the differences between management accounting and finance. Now, the first misconception is that these two courses are different. In actual fact, what I found within my studies is that there are quite a lot of similarities between them. You see, management accounting tends to focus more in the short term, whereas finance or financial management tends to look at more of a long term focus horizon. If I give you an example, if we think about decision making is a vital tool for any business. However, in the short term, businesses are making completely different decisions. They want to survive, they want to make sure that they cover at least their fixed costs. So topics like relevant costing become relevant, which posit that if I'm able from an incremental perspective cover at least my variable costs, then I can get a contribution that can at least eat into my fixed costs so that I can survive in the short term. That thinking changes a bit in the long term, where you now start factoring in things like fixed costs because they ultimately can change over 2 or 3 year horizons. And you have this element of discounting that comes in. But ultimately, whether you're looking at decision making in the short term, relevant costing, or decision making in the long term, capital budgeting, the principles stay exactly the same, i.e., we look at cash flows, number one, in making the analysis in both of the subjects. Secondly, we're interested in incremental cash flows, i.e., cash flows that are changing as a direct result of the decision that I'm making. They would have been different had I made or not concluded on this specific project. Once you start realizing that there are broad similarities between the topics, you then become better positions to succeed. So my advice to you is to watch out for the links, especially as you go through in your studies from third year to CTA and ITC. The links between the two topics or the two subjects between management, accounting, and finance will become increasingly important. The sooner you start seeing the links, the better it is for you in your studies. The second thing that I think is important in management, accounting, and finance is that most students tend to make the mistake of studying in silos. Now, studying in silos or the topics in isolation without any broad context is a recipe for disaster, especially as the topics become increasingly integrated and the questions become increasingly complex. Now, my advice to you is that try to detect the themes when you're studying management accounting and finance. For example, if we look at management accounting, it's broadly solving business problems. You can categorize the different topics that you learn into different business problems that are being solved. For example, there's decision making. Within decision making, you get to make decisions about pricing. This is where relevant costing may come in. Equally, if the pricing decisions you're making are within a divisionalized structure, then there's specific considerations there. And topics like transfer pricing as well come in. If you're making decisions with respect to risk management, then a topic like cost, volume, profit comes in CVP, where we learn about break even, margin of safety, in order to be able to assess risk in the short term. Cost and control is another area of management accounting. Then we could use standard costing, which looks at what are the standards and I compare it to what actually transpired in my business and understand variances and interpret the variances in order to make my production processes more efficient or better yet, have corrective action to hold people accountable. I could equally use target costing, which looks at what is my ideal cost relative to the price that I could equally look at Kaizen costing, right? All of these are cost control mechanisms that all serve a purpose within cost control and management. Then there's inventory valuation and how I could have all these different costing systems, from an absorption costing system, which tends to lead a lot of credence towards manufacturing costs. Then you get your variable costing systems, as well as your process costing systems and byproduct costing systems. Now, when you understand the themes, you won't conflate the issues. You understand exactly in a question if it's all about inventory valuation or cost allocation. Then I know I need to spend my focus on absorption costing or join to a byproduct costing or process costing. But now, if the question is more about decision making, then I need to look at what type of decision I'm making. Is it risk, therefore it's CVP, or is it pricing, therefore I look at relevant costing or transfer pricing? That is the theme that you need to be looking at from a management accounting perspective. But now, if you were to look at it from a finance perspective, what you'd look at is what are the broad themes within finance. The first could be when you have the investment decision. So within the investment decision is I'm trying to understand what is the best decision I should make from an investment perspective. So topics like valuations come in handy, cost of capital come in handy, and working capital. Sometimes I need to understand how to finance the assets. That's when the financing decisions come in, which links to capital structure and cost of capital. In other instances, I might be looking at the dividend decision. When should I pay a dividend? What are the implications of not paying a dividend? Or what type of dividend, if possible, should I be paying? Then I could also look at strategy. Now, strategy is a broad topic which talks to how do I achieve my vision and mission in the business? And equally, the techniques I use there, I could use to analyze risk, especially from a finance perspective in the long term. Or financial analysis, which is another tool that I could use to interpret results and provide corrective action. Regardless of whether you look at management accounting or finance, these broad themes are quite important for you to become successful. Now, what are the benefits when you start learning in terms of these themes and you're able to categorize the topics within them? The first is that learning becomes much easier. Instead of you trying to cram information and cram things, you actually understand the business problems that the topics are solving. And inherently, that's what management accounting and finance is. It's tools that we're using to solve practical business solutions, either in the short or long term. So when I'm able to categorize and be able to put them into these buckets, I know exactly what type of problems they're solving, which makes learning more enjoyable and more practical. The second thing is that it allows you to be more competitive and to be more successful in integrated questions. Trust me, I know this from experience. I can recall when I did my ITC, where the first three papers were highly geared towards strategy, highly geared towards management accounting and finance. Because I understood broadly what the topics were designed to do, I didn't get flustered by the nature of the examination. I purely looked at what problem is this question highlighting, and then I knew in my toolbox what was the best topic to solve that problem. And that's important as ITC and CTA is moving towards practical questions and moving towards integration. It's good that you prepare yourself so that you can position yourself to be successful. The third important element of why this becomes important is that ultimately, with the integration, you are now in a better position to be able to solve problems easier in your subjects. When you solve problems easier, right, you can then become more successful and ultimately be best positions to be the better version of yourself as a student. Another important element that we want to talk about is subject specific advice. Now, as we look at subject specific advice, the first subject we'll talk about is management accounting. Now, management accounting is an interesting topic, an interesting subject in general, but ultimately I found there were a variety of characteristics of the subjects that you should be aware of and things that you should look at, especially if you want to be successful. The first thing is that don't take the math in management accounting for granted. Now, silly things that you might take for granted, like 1 hour equals 60 minutes, or 1 meter equals 100 centimeters is crucial in management accounting. Remember, management accounting is all about resources, production, and optimizing on production processes. And most of the time, you always have to do these conversions where it has nothing to do with management accounting, the principles that are embedded in it, but it's more about logic. Do you understand logical maths that one pair equals two items? These realizations became critical for me. The more questions I started doing, the more I started practicing, I realized that it was important for me to get a grip and to understand that each scenario for management accounting was unique. I had to respect each and every question and therefore understand and appreciate the nuances, especially as it pertained to the maths. The first topic then links to the second issue that I want to raise within management accounting advice is that your scenario is very important. Now, I learned this in one of the tests that I did in my undergrad, where I got the highest mark I ever got for management accounting, which is around 95%. Granted, I know what you're thinking, this guy's a genius. Well, I wasn't really a genius, but something stood out to me when I got 95% for that test. I actually realized that I spent a lot of time reading the scenario before I actually wrote. I can even vividly remember me still reading, and people around me were still writing frantically. But I had the patience, I had the wherewithal to understand that I was competing with myself, and there was no reason for me to rush and write when I didn't fully grasp the scenario. Guess what, guys? I spent an extra 10 minutes, but I understood exactly what the scenario is about. I understood all the risks. What were the business risks within this entity? And that's a bit of pro tip for you as well. When you analyze a management accounting scenario, understand all the business risk and where they are. I secondly understood the cost card. Guys, this is so crucial. The cost card in management accounting is the key. Understanding that this product consists of labor, materials, overheads, then understanding exactly how many hours go into that specific cost card and what is the cost per hour. So understanding the input from a resource perspective and what the cost was for that input per unit, and appreciating where there were overheads and how I need to potentially allocate either using an activity based costing system or traditional costing system. All of these made me equipped in such a way that I answered the questions very quickly. I didn't frantically go and look at the scenario and see what did they say. Because I had embedded the knowledge, I'd summarized it nicely. I knew the cost card, I knew the risks. When the questions came, I kind of anticipated them. I wrote quickly and I wrote confidently and ultimately did well. So my advice to you is that always make sure with reading time when it comes to management accounting. Your reading time is crucial and it's critical if you want to be successful. Don't focus on what people are doing next to you. Focus rather, and if it takes an extra 5 minutes or so to get a handle of the scenario, so be it. Do it. And of course, over time, as you practice more and more questions, you are more likely going to come up with a more effective method that works for yourself to be able to analyze scenarios effectively, efficiently, and for you to maximize marks. The third thing that I found with management accounting is that I had to appreciate that practice made perfect, right? I had to practice, 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 practice. Now, management accounting is one of those practical subjects, as I've already alluded to, and there tends to be trends and tricks that tend to come about. The more I practiced, the more confidence I got, and the more I was able to understand where the tricks typically came in, whether it was the nuances within transfer pricing or the nuances between cost behavior. It was easier for me to pick it up in an actual test because I'd practiced so many times. So at the core of doing well in management accounting is definitely practicing. Do all the tutorials and look at additional questions as well until the information or the knowledge within that topic is embedded correctly within you. The next thing that is important in my mind is that you then need to understand why. Why do the topics look the way they do? Now, a part of this will come from the studying, but the majority of it will also come from doing the questions. But ultimately, once you've done the questions, and you've done the studying, you need to reflect holistically and ask yourself, what was this topic trying to achieve? Let me give you an example of how this can practically play out. Let's look at variable selling costs, right? So variable selling costs, typically in a cost allocation basis, when I'm using an absorption costing system and I'm trying to measure inventory for IS2 purposes, would typically be expensed. Remember, guys, an absorption costing system would say that you only include manufacturing costs. So these are both manufacturing variable costs and manufacturing fixed costs. So if it's manufacturing variable costs, I'm able to trace it to each cost object or unit. If it's a fixed cost, I need to come up with some allocation method in order to allocate it to a product. But regardless, they both need to be included in the cost of the product. Now, if it's a variable selling cost, right, it's not manufacturing. So because it's not manufacturing, in an absorption costing system, I would not include it in the cost of inventory. The opposite is true when I now look at cost volume profit, because in cost volume profit, I'm actually making risk decisions in the short term. And here, like we alluded to initially, is that companies simply want to cover their fixed costs. They want to ensure that they at least break even. So in you determining that break-even element, of course, you're going to want to incorporate all your variable costs, including the variable costs that are selling costs. So I found these nuances, these slight nuances where in an absorption costing system under inventory valuation, I was expensing my selling costs and capitalizing my fixed costs. Whereas when I was doing cost volume profit, my fixed costs were deemed irrelevant, so they were not necessarily in my analysis from a unit cost perspective. But however, I was including my variable selling cost because I was viewing that as a short-term relevant cost that was incremental in terms of my decision making in the short term. So there you go, that there's different treatment for the same cost depending on the objective of what you're trying to achieve. And you can only be able to pick up those things if you understand why the topic is designed the way it is. What is it trying to achieve? And that's why I always recommend to understand the why so that you can position yourself to do. The last thing is that you need to consult. In most instances, what will happen is that scenarios can get tricky, and you may even look at the memorandum and the memorandum doesn't make sense at all. Instead of spending hours and hours and hours on end trying to understand what that memorandum is trying to achieve, the best thing is to actually ask a lecturer or ask a tutor, because they would have a quick answer for you, which could save you a lot of time. And I found this very important within my studies, that when I got stuck, I used to flag it and flag the question on the side. But I knew that I was going to consult on that question with my lecturers, with my tutors. And number one, this gave me the confidence to know that when a problem arose, I could get help quickly and then learn from it so that I didn't repeat it. Secondly, I didn't waste time because I got the answer quickly. So consulting is important for management accounting, building those relationships with your tutors so that you can start excelling in the course. Now, let's look at the next subject specific advice, and this is specifically for finance, right? Now, what I found in finance, there were broad areas as well that I had to pick up. The first thing is that just like management accounting, the scenario was key. The second thing is that most students, when it comes to finance, struggle with theory questions. This makes sense in a way because normally when they teach the finance topics, they'll teach you about the formulas, they'll teach you about the process in terms of doing the calculations. All of a sudden, when you go to the tutorials, they're asking a lot of theory questions. And then when you go to the test, again, theory questions. Now, SAICA, in terms of its assessments, whether it's at a CTA level or ITC level or beyond, is moving towards understanding and analyzing questions from a theory perspective. When you start appreciating this, it means that you also need to gear yourself up to do well in theory questions. It's not enough just to give up and say, theory questions are not for me. You need to find ways to do well. And what I found is that in order to do well with theory questions, is firstly, I needed to lean on the scenario heavily. A mistake that students do is that they want to theory dump. And I fell into this trap as well initially when I was doing finance, because they teach us all these models like Pestle, the Matrix, or in terms of GEC, ANSOF, as well as the Boston Consulting Group Matrix. And they teach you Porter's Five Forces, Pestle. You're so eager to just go in there and just put in answers. And that tends to yield to results that are not fruitful for you, because what you're writing is not in the memorandum and you end up not getting the marks and you become frustrated. Instead, what you should be doing is that about 70% or 80% of your theory marks should be coming from the scenario. So as you read the scenario, look at what is it alluding to? What risks is it talking about? And when you see things like, oh, our revenue went down because we decided to increase in the current period, that's a clear indication that you can use in your theory questions to explain why revenues are down. Or they tell you that there was a new competitor that entered the market that then eroded our market share. Again, that's in the scenario. You can use that to justify why revenues and profits are down. So instead of you creating your own answer out of thin air, rather rely on the information in the scenario, rely on the information in the scenario, rely on the information that's there in order to guide you to be able to provide an effective response to the questions. And only once you've used the majority of the marks and try to apply to the scenario to your best of your abilities, then for the next 20% of those theory marks, you can start using your models like Pestle to say, have I considered any political, economic, legal, environmental, social, technological issues in the scenario that might yield me my points? But even then, as you use the models, apply them to the scenario. Don't just use them in a vacuum or use them just in terms of what you saw in other tests. Always apply to the scenario. And also, as you look at qualitative measures and you use qualitative measures within maybe topics like capital budgeting, a mistake that students make is that they want to reiterate the same quantitative points. Theory, guys, means other than quantitative issues. So if they say, what are the qualitative issues? Don't re-explain issues that are already covered in your quantitative analysis. So if in your quantitative analysis, you've already talked about sales, it doesn't make sense to talk about sales again in your qualitative points. Try to look at issues that haven't been covered in your quantitative analysis. And equally, those issues must be incremental. Just because it's a theory question doesn't mean that you shouldn't obey the principles of, is this issue incremental? For example, in South Africa, most of the companies might be struggling with load shedding. Of course, load shedding has gotten better now, but it's still a real issue. Now, if you raise load shedding as a point, it might be valid to consider, but is it an incremental issue in relation to an investment that I'm making in Cape Town, for example? Probably not, right? Unless you structure it in such a way that you say Cape Town maybe has better infrastructure, better to avoid load shedding, then perhaps. But even then, that's still a stretch, because now you're using conjecture, you using far-fetched points. You better served rather focusing on qualitative issues that are specific to the decision that you're trying to make, that are specific to the question that is being asked to you, rather than broad business risks that could apply to any entity. The next thing that I think is important there is that you need to find a way to answer these questions, this critically analyze question, critically evaluate. And I found these questions to be increasingly prevalent in third year, and more especially in CTA, where you're so used to doing evaluation, and all of a sudden now they give you evaluation in a test and they say, please evaluate this valuation, evaluate the inputs that were used here. And often than not, the wheels tend to come off the car because you're not used to answering these type of questions. But I found there's like 4 key themes that you can use to maximize on these type of questions. The first thing is try to look at mathematical errors, right? Of course, critically evaluate questions would tend to focus on both the good and the bad. But what I've found in most instances, there's a high weighting on the bad. So focus on the bad, and majority of your marks, say 70 to 80%, will likely be on the bad, or the issues that they are not doing or not addressing correctly. The first thing that will come up is look at mathematical errors. So mathematical errors would be mistakes that they make in terms of the arithmetic calculations, costing issues, right? All of those issues would probably be what I try to look at to score marks. Secondly, principle issues, right? When you look at what principles are they applying and whether those principles are consistent with what you've learned. So, for example, if they are not including, or if they in their working capital analysis are including the totals rather than the movements in the capital budgeting questions, already you know that's an issue. You've learned that I don't include the balances for working capital, but rather the movements in the balances, right? That's a principal issue. The third one could be look at assumptions, especially when you look at things like valuations or even capital budgeting when I'm estimating future cash flows, any estimate for that matter. Does the estimate make sense? And you could look at past trends, and often what they'll do, they'll give you information about past sales, about past financial data, and then analyze that financial data and then consider what the prior numbers were from a growth perspective and compare with what are the growth numbers that are being projected, and equally look at the environment in which they are growing in order to assess the reasonability. One wouldn't expect, for example, an entity that's operating in the South African clothing industry to be growing by 20%. That's just not practical. With the clothing industry stagnating at best, growth figures should be modest. Those are the type of logical things you look at. You look at past trends, you look at what's happening in the industry, what's happening with competitors. All of these are important issues that you can use to criticize potential valuations or potential inputs that are given to you in a question. And then lastly, look at challenges. How can you challenge the calculation or challenge them to consider other factors that they didn't? For example, it could be that in the scenario, right, there's no specific mention of a terminal value potentially, right? Because maybe it will end. Then you can question things like that. Have we considered the existence of a terminal value and how long our project will last, whether it's a specifically termed project or if it will continue into perpetuity? These are the type of logical questions that you start asking or challenging in order to be able to score marks, right? The last or the second penultimate issue within finance is that always, again, try to do the questions as I've mentioned, very practical subject finance. The more questions you do, the better you become. So it's critical that you always do the questions so that you can maximize your experience in the topic and do well, right? And then lastly, as with management accounting, consulting is key. And I found that actually paying attention in class, in addition to consulting, was also invaluable for a subject like finance. Remember, guys, finance can be quite practical. And sometimes there's these jargon that they use, right? Familiarize yourself with that jargon. Like what I used to do is that signed up for an account with Investopedia, and this actually helped me understand the jargon. So when they started talking about long positions, short positions, leverage, all of these became topics that I were familiar with me because I took the time to learn, to research and understand what the business aspects were. You should do the same thing. Sign up for an account with Investopedia. Equally, pay attention in class. Normally, the lecturers are vastly experienced. They understand the concepts. And it's way difficult to simply read a finance book, especially if the material is still new and abstract to you. So leverage your lecturers and tutors so that they can guide you and give you the knowledge, especially in class. Ask the right questions. Why is this important? What am I trying to achieve? Where does this fit in? So that you can better be equipped to study post class and to attempt the questions. Right, guys? Hopefully this video was helpful and now you more equipped to tackle management, accounting, and finance. At the end of the day, these topics are very, very, very similar to each other. Now let's chat in the comment section. Have I forgotten any elements of management, accounting, or finance? What other techniques are you using to help you excel in these subjects? Let's share in the community. Remember to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Let's share it and make sure that the message goes across. I appreciate everything you're doing. And until we meet again, remember, I believe in you. Bye.